if the Catholic Church is really the place where God gets into the depths of our life in all of its joys, all of its sorrows, all of its brokenness, and its shortfallings, and gives us the grace to be conformed and transformed and renewed so that we might image Christ in our own particular way. Well, you'd expect there to be plenty of people who aren't fully there yet. I would not trust a hospital that I walked into and there were no sick people there. Like that would
you guys doing here?
Very suspect, right? So you don't judge a hospital by the fact there are sick people in it, but you do judge a hospital on, do the people who are in there, are there examples of people who've gotten better?
Right.
My dad was a Lutheran.
Okay.
My mom became a Lutheran when she married my dad. So I was raised within a Lutheran context, but they had also met in a charismatic community, and so there was a sort of a kind of charismatic spirituality that undergirded a lot of the Lutheranism that I had. So Lutheranism with a little bit of kind of Pentecostalism thrown into it, if you will.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So you grew up in that. Did it sink in your life early on?
I think it did.
Okay.
Everyone's has different things that sink in.
Yeah.
Growing up, prayer was really important to our family, and church was really important to our family, and so I was surrounded by those things throughout my life. My dad would lead music most weekends at our church, and for a long time we were at a church where we were setting up and taking down a gym every week, and so we would spend hours there at church. We would go to Wednesday night Bible studies. They had small groups. They had all that sort of stuff. Church was at the epicenter of a lot of what we did, and also for a number of years I went to a Lutheran school as well, so I was getting that part as part of my education. So it was a huge part of the milieu of my life growing up. But then when I became a little bit older, entered high school, that's really where the question came up for me, is this the way that I want to live my life? And I think that's about the time that God started getting a hold of my life in a pretty particular way. And at that point, it was not through Lutheranism in particular, but it was more, I got connected to another group of folks, some people that were at my church, but a group of guys that came from other backgrounds. And I started to see in how they lived out their life, there's a way that Jesus can be living and active, and is present in a way that's not just, this is the family religion, but
Right.
this is something that's real. It's critical. It's important. So there was a couple of years there early on in my high school career where I would say God ceased to be the center of my life, and I was exploring what really should it be about. I was into music, and so I was thinking about, I was joining bands and playing music and spending a lot of time practicing and thinking, well, is this what I'm made for? But then, after I got connected to these people who were really focused on their faith at the center, and they made all the other parts of life just a way of digging into that. So I started, instead of just doing bands, it would be, worship music, or I was part of a number of Christian bands that were punk rock bands, but they were like Jesus punk rock bands or whatever. So music, for a while there, maybe that had been like an idol in my life, but then it became a servant to Christ.
Yeah.
And so, from that point forward, I would say I became really, Jesus has been at the center of not every decision of my life, not every moment of my life, but if there's a thing that everything is kind of oriented and constantly being brought back towards, that's there. So it did stick in a certain sense, but the particulars of Lutheranism, those continued to be a part of my faith, but I I stopped seeking maybe conformity to, like when I was going to Lutheran school, you'd have to memorize Luther's
Yeah.
small catechism. And so I was less focused on conforming to the confessions of the Lutheran Church, and more, I want to find Jesus where he's at. And that kind of is maybe the first impetus that started me on this journey towards eventually becoming a Catholic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I always chuckle a little bit these days when a Protestant to Catholic convert has a music background, especially with like some of the punk rock. Or I just talked to a guy on the Journey Home program the other day who was like, he was like in like the like hard, like Christian hard rock or something as part of his past, you know. And what we talked about afterwards, kind of interesting, is it's like to some degree in the evangelical group that he ran in, it was sort of a grasping at a whole spirituality that it didn't have. Right. In some sense, you can make a little bit more sense of some of the ethos in a Catholic context.
It is interesting. I do notice this. I still like Christian, like heavy metal and stuff. Like I like metalcore, and I was in some of those bands. And I do think one of the things that attracted me to it was it's not serious in its own way, but there's that kind of this idea, like if I'm going to do something, I want to do it like as hard and as maybe sincerely as possible. And in that scene, it's kind of an extreme. And if there's anything that has always turned me off to religion, it's always kind of like a milquetoast approach. And so, if you're gonna play music for Jesus, play it loud, play it hard, play it fast.
Yeah.
Or, I mean, there's lots of other ways to do it, but do it sincerely and with your whole heart.
Yeah.
So it might be, in my current expression, if you're gonna do music for Jesus, well, chant, but you learn Latin or something, like do something hard with it. So I don't mind any of the aesthetics, but what I don't like is something it's performative rather than
manufactured. Yeah. Another thing I wonder about it too is just like, because Catholicism is comfortable with the both and, right?
Yeah.
There's that quality throughout Catholic theology where the things that we would tend to want to oversimplify and try to pull apart so that we can understand them on a human level, it keeps them together. And sometimes it seems like some of that more kind of hard Christian music is sort of it's a swinging pendulum to the other direction, to what it's, God's mercy and love, 100% yes. But also like God's great mystery, and there's a darkness in prayer and the Job experience and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, it is. I think that's one of the things I love about the Catholic Church, and the thing that drew me in is there is so much there that touches on every part of who you are. And like there's this depth of spirituality around suffering. There's this spirituality around joy. There's a spirituality around your calling, and there's a spirituality around the setbacks that you face. There's saints that have gone to every area of life and have jumped into it and discovered, what does it look like to be Jesus in this place, in this time, with these gifts and with these circumstances. And that's been a thing that's kept me Catholic since I joined, probably more than anything else. Sometimes you run into people in the Catholic Church that may not be perfect, right? Like me.
And you weren't asking for hands? Okay, sorry.
So, when you run into particularly some of the terrible abuses or whatever that you experience in the church, there might be a tendency to say, well, this is crap. I don't want to be a part of this anymore. And I've had those moments where you go and you feel like, oh, the pastor or the leaders or the bishop, or you feel disheartened to the core of your being because of the fallenness of the people who make up the church. But then I'm always brought back to, well, what's the goal, right? And if the goal is to be really that I become the person God made me to be, that I might be conformed with every area of my life to the image of Christ, I want a place that has a track record of doing that with some people. And the Catholic Church offers the saints. That's one thing that I really, really love about the Catholic Church, that wasn't really a key part of my Lutheran upbringing. We would maybe pay lip service to calling St. Paul or St. Luke, but we didn't really think about saints in the same way, where there's this amazing history of people that it's worked with. Like, there's people who, they're still following this, but there's people where you see them get well. Like they show up as sinners and they leave as sanctified. And I often think about this analogy of a hospital. And so, if the Catholic Church is really the place where God gets into the depths of our life in all of its joys, all of its sorrows, all of its brokenness, and its shortfallings, and gives us the grace to be conformed and transformed and renewed so that we might image Christ in our own particular way. Well, you'd expect there to be plenty of people who aren't fully there yet. I would not trust a hospital that I walked into and there were no sick people there. Like, that would,
what are you guys doing here?
Very suspect, right? So you don't judge a hospital by the fact there are sick people in it, but you do judge a hospital on, do the people who are in there, are there examples of people who've gotten better?
Right.
And when we're dealing with something as complicated as converting our will, our life, all of these things, the fact that we do have these people who have been transformed and kind of the whole world and experiencing that pendulum, all these various ways of needing to be redeemed, and they experience that. And so that's been really key in my own, I guess, coming to terms with the fact that I have to go to church with sinners like myself.
Yeah. I love the lives of the saints in that they're just so weird, right? So you really dig into them beyond the baseball card stats. And they're not, gosh, if you were making them up, man, you'd keep them a lot more simple, but they're strange people.
Oh yeah.
From every different temperament, every different personality. And but going back to your story a bit here, up to that point in your life, would you have considered yourself a Protestant? Would you identify with that term?
At certain points, yes. At certain points, no.
Okay.
Right. I wouldn't deny being a Protestant, but I always found there was a part of me that ached for a unified church. And because of that, I didn't want to be somebody who was primarily associated with being against something.
Right.
I wanted to focus on, okay, what am I for? So I loved a lot of the things about the Lutheran Church. When I was in the Lutheran Church, I did eventually work in some other denominations and study with other denominations as well. And each of them have graces that I really appreciated. But at the core, I think for me, the journey was always towards Jesus. And so if someone said, are you Catholic or Protestant? I would say, well, yeah, I'm a Protestant if we had to choose it, but most fundamentally, I'm a Christian. Yeah. And so I think that's maybe how I would have answered that question.
Yeah. But when you met that new crowd, kind of showed you a more intentional Christian life, is that start setting you on that path towards ministry at that point, or was there more?
So that's an interesting question. Yes and no. So when I first started coming, so there was this group that would meet on Friday nights, and it was people of a lot of different church backgrounds. There's some Catholics that were there. There's some of the Lutherans from my church were the ones who invited me initially. There's some Presbyterians and non-denominational. Every once in a while, you can get an Orthodox person that would show up, and lots of people who were not Christian at all. And that was the thing that was really compelling, is you'd see these people who would come in the door and they didn't have any kind of faith background or very limited faith background, and they would become transformed. So it was not long. I had only been coming there for a week or two, and I got this strong sense that, God wanted me to step up in some way, to lead in some way. And then right after, so I was in the prayer meeting on that Friday night, and I was just sensing God say to me, like, I want you to stand up and lead. And this is when I was a high school student. I was just a sophomore in high school. And after, the guy who was leading the group at the time, who I had never really met before, he came up to me and I said, I hear you're going to this high school. I went to a high school called Huron in Ann Arbor. He said, I hear you're going to Huron High School. I would like you to start a men's group there to reach out to the students that go. So he called me out right at that moment when I was open to it. And I was like, you don't even know me. But he was just that kind of person who just kind of grabs people and is like, you go. So he commissioned me and he said, I know you don't know what you're doing, but let me meet with you every week and I'll mentor you into it. So I started a men's group and we started we call it Bible club. That was kind of an official club at the school. And I would spend really the rest of my high school career with this group. We would gather together for prayer in the mornings, and we would have lunch together. We'd meet after school once a week and I would lead music and I would teach, and I just became a part of this thing we were doing. And then from there I would invite the people that we were gathering up from the high school, and we'd bring them to this group, and it grew, and we had just lots of young people from all over the county that started to show up to this thing. And I was in leadership there for many years. So I started leading, eventually was invited to come on staff, and then eventually led the whole ministry myself of this thing. It was called Mission Christ. So all in all, kind of the first 7 years of my ministry life, if you will, started when I was just kind of called out to lead, just as a young fella in high school. And I didn't think it was going to be my whole life at that time. I just thought I'm going to be faithful in this moment to be in Salt and Light, to be an evangelist in my school.
Right.
But after I graduated high school, I was working at a hardware store. And I remember very distinctly, I had this little green Gideon's Pocket Bible that someone had given me. And every break, I would just spend time like reading through the scriptures. And there was this one day on my break that just I felt like God was saying to me, this is when I was early in college, I want you to go into ministry. Like this is the path. I want you to give your life to build up my church. And so I left my shift and I immediately drove to the Lutheran church that I had continued to be a member of. And there was a guy there, Byron, who was in charge of young like high school ministry and some other stuff. And I knocked on his office door and said, I was just praying and I felt like God was calling me into ministry. And I don't know what to do with that. And you're like one of the few people I know who's made this into a profession. He says, it's really funny that you mentioned that. I was just praying and I felt like God was calling me to raise up leaders in the ministry. So I started meeting with him then every week. And eventually that was my next ministry job is I became kind of the associate youth minister or whatever at that church, which I led into taking on a ministry at another church after that. And so at that point, I would say that's when it changed. I moved into a kind of a ministry degree path, changed schools, all that. I wound up getting my BA in religious studies. And that eventually led to getting an MDiv and all that kind of stuff to prepare for, a life of professional ministry.
Gotcha. Where'd you go to school?
So I began at a school called William Tyndale in Farmington Hills, Michigan. And while I was there, the school collapsed financially. And so then I finished up my BA at Regent University in Virginia Beach. But I had enough credits where I was actually able to just finish up the degree doing some online courses. So I was able to stay in ministry in Michigan and finish up that BA from there. And so that was my first theology degree. But then as I was working, I worked as a youth minister. I was the music director at another church. There was a church that was kind of dying. And another guy, this guy, Sung Kim, came in, and he was a pastor in the Reformed Church of America. And he had heard about me, and he said, hey, would you help me? We're going to sell off our building. We're going to kind of restart this church. So I got involved with that project as the music director for their first season of life, and we launched this thing called Grace Ann Arbor, and it's now I think they have 4 sites. It's a big church in the Southeast Michigan area. They're around Ann Arbor and some of the Detroit suburbs and things. But yeah, that became another phase of ministry with them. But while I was there, I started to get this sense that we were bringing in a lot of people. But as I was meeting the people that were walking through the doors, it was almost all transfer growth. It's people who they were a member of a different church and they're joining this church, or they moved to Ann Arbor and they were a member of a church over on the other side of the state or a different place or whatever, and they were looking for a new church to be a part of. And my heart, because I had done almost a decade of this ministry with the kind of the unchurched youth,
right?
I thought, there's people out there who are hungry to know Jesus who have never met him before. And we're making this a really comfortable place for Christians. But I had this heart. I'm like, what does it take to get out into the corners of our community that don't know Jesus? And so at that point, I began to seriously consider, like, what does it look like to plant a church? I actually tried to plant a church on my own initially. And so me and a couple friends started a little church, and it was fine. But I realized, like, this church is way more about me and my preferences and not really enough about honoring a bigger community. And so I wound up leaving that church, and it still existed for a number of years after I left it. But then saying I'm going to enroll in a formal seminary and try to work within a real denomination. And I had been, like I mentioned, involved with the Lutheran Church. I was in the Missouri Synod, but I didn't see them as doing that thing that I really was hungry for either. They were really, and this is not every Lutheran church, but as I looked at the ethos of the denomination, it was a maintenance model of Christendom rather than maybe a missional model of being out in the highways and the byways.
Right.
And I ran into this denomination at a conference called the Evangelical Covenant Church, which was related to the Lutheran Pietist movement. And so then at that point, I began having conversations with the denominational leadership about planning a church and working with them. And so at this point, I had recently gotten married, and we were kind of figuring out what are we going to do. And so I tell my wife, we're going to move to Chicago. We're going to go to North Park Theological Seminary. I'm going to get my MDiv, and then we'll hopefully move back and start a church. And to her credit, even though this is not her vision for her life, she agreed. And so we moved on. So my next degree was from North Park Theological Seminary in Chicago, which is the seminary of the Evangelical Covenant Church. So I spent a season of ministry working within that denomination. And that was kind of my last denominational home before the Lord kicked me into the Catholic Church.
Was your wife of a similar theological background or faith background?
No, so the thing that's very interesting is my wife was raised Catholic.
That's right.
And so this is one of the things that was actually maybe it was definitely a grace. A lot of people who are in ministry and join the Catholic Church have to deal with a wife that maybe is resistant to it. In my case, I was trying to figure out how do I work in ministry with this albatross around my neck, which is I had a Catholic wife. And so as I was having like search committee meetings, looking for church jobs and things like that, people were often very skeptical. Like, how could you be married to a Catholic? When I was working at this one church, I had the board of elders, just a number of them were hard set against me because my wife is Catholic. So my wife, how we managed our family, so this is early on, while we were dating, engaged, and in the first years of our marriage, she would come to my church where I was working, and then we would go to Catholic Mass in the evenings. So we'd find a church that would have like a 5 p.m. evening Mass. this is one of the things that actually began to draw me to the Catholic Church was I had been working as a professional Christian for years at this point, and there were very few contexts where I could go and be a worshiper first and foremost.
Right.
And so as I would sneak into the back pew Sunday evenings and sit there, it was a place where it was just me and Jesus. No one knew who I was. No one cared what I did. I didn't have to worry about the sound system or prep my sermon notes or anything like that. It was just me and Jesus. And I began to fall in love with the liturgy and become, I would say, like almost viscerally hungry for the Eucharist as it was there. I don't know what it was about it, but just my heart was drawn towards Christ on the altar.
Yeah.
And so it was always very bittersweet to go to Mass because I loved being with Jesus there, but then I was never able to go up and receive him in the way that my heart longed for. So I think that was, there was many things along my journey that drove me to the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
Even before I had met my wife, I had begun encountering some of the strange things with Catholic spirituality and Catholic prayer, and had begun experimenting. But then having that weekly place where I can kind of let the experiment run wild, to start talking to Jesus about it and seeing the icons and hearing the liturgy and experiencing the sacramental life, and even if only from the outside in a certain sense. That was a true blessing. And so if on my journey to the Catholic faith, I think I had a much easier path than many of the other folks that started out in ministry, because although my wife she never pushed me. Like, she never was like, "Oh, you're going to become Catholic," or anything like that. She's not, no, be a faithful minister, be a faithful follower of Jesus, care for your people, do a good job on what you're doing, but in all things, seek the face of God. That's how she encouraged me.
Yeah.
And after I became Catholic, she's like, I never worried about it because I saw in you someone who loved Jesus and was seeking after him. And because I believed the Catholic Church was true, I knew you'd get there eventually.
Yeah.
Like, that's a pretty remarkable posture to take. And I don't know if it will always work, but in my case, having someone who says, I don't understand the path that you're on. Maybe I wouldn't agree with every choice that you're making, but I want to encourage you to seek Jesus every day.
Yeah.
And she continues to be that in my life, because it's not like I suddenly became a saint on Easter when I joined the Catholic Church 11 years ago. I'm still needing that encouragement every day to seek the face of Jesus.
Well, I'm sure it was a combination, like you said, of the fact that, again, as we would propose, the Catholic Church is true, and that your wife was encouraging you and praying for you. But also, I'm sure what she recognized in you is just that this is someone who's still on the journey, right? Like, even if when you meet people, even of different philosophical or theological background, different churches, there's obviously division. But when you meet someone who's very different in that regard, but they're still on a journey, right? Like they haven't given up, they haven't settled, they're not comfortable, they're still searching. It's like, just keep going, right? I don't know the path, I don't know how the Holy Spirit will work it out, but it's what's on the same token, you meet plenty of fellow Catholics who, you don't know their hearts, but it sure seems like they've stopped journeying, right? And that's more the issue, that we can't stop this side of heaven.
Yeah,
we got to keep going. Lord, what is your will for my life today?
Yeah. And that's actually one of the things that has helped me in the midst of sort of coming to terms with not being a lay person now, which is, I'm not up on stage on Sunday, but I do have the opportunity to talk to people on different levels of journey. And sometimes that's somebody out on the streets, and sometimes that might be a person that shares a pew with me. But all of us are being called to respond to Jesus, to have an awareness of where God's at work. And one of the maybe the things I've noticed over the years is some people that on the surface, when you meet them, might seem furthest away from God. They might be an avowed atheist or even a Satanist or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact that they're avowed anything is actually like a pretty good sign, because that means they're engaging with maybe like metaphysics in a way that someone who's content to be a cafeteria Catholic might not be. And it might take more, I guess, shaking up of the Holy Spirit to get the guy who K through 12 Catholic education, goes to mass, when it's convenient. That it may take more to get that person saying, actually, no, I want Christ to be at the center of my life, rather than just a peripheral identity that I have, than somebody who is saying, I don't have it all together. I'm trying to figure things out. I might be worshiping Thor today, but
it's like my favorite book. You got the Chesterton book on there. Like The Ball and the Cross is one of my favorite of his books. Which, for those who haven't read it, right, like you got this Catholic Scottish guy and this atheist Scottish guy, and I won't give away the book, but the point is that like they are seeming opposites, but they end up becoming the best of friends precisely because they're guys on a journey. They stand for something. They're searching. They want to have the truth, and it's like they end up finding so much more in common with each other than so many other people they meet along their adventure. Right.
Yeah, and that's the way that I certainly feel about it. I've got a book club that has been meeting for years at my house on Sunday evenings, and it's me and my wife, and we've got there's an atheist that attends, there's a Buddhist priest that attends, and we engage with we read through the Divine Comedy together, canto by canto. We read through recently Canterbury Tales and things like that, where there's a lot of rich theological content, and we have very good conversations about it. And it's wonderful, even though there's people there who may seem very much further away from orthodoxy, if you will, than somebody who attends my parish. But they keep showing up and they keep engaging, and I find a lot of hope in that.
Yeah, praise God.
Yeah.
So seminary in Chicago, right? That's where we left off. What happened there?
So seminary in Chicago was a really phenomenal experience. Got to go back to school, learn about theology, learn Hebrew and Greek better. I had studied a little bit in undergrad, but I think opening the world of biblical scholarship was really critical there. But I also began to explore more deeply the issues of church history and kind of theological underpinnings of the faith. And some of the seeds that had been planted before began to take root, where I started to say, what really separates me from all the other heretics in history or schismatics? What is what was the earliest church like, and how did they answer some of these theological questions?
Right.
And how did they see the work of Jesus actually, taking root in us? And the denomination I had moved into, it was kind of interesting because they were founded, if there's any theological principle that sort of founded them, it was probably a suspicion of substitutionary atonement theology. And so they had a lot of wrestling with soteriology within the seminary. Like, how is it that we're saved? What's the model or the framework through which we can understand what it is that Christ did for us on the cross? And that was really important for me. That was actually one of the questions that had been on my mind, like an incessant dinging for years. Before I moved to Chicago, we had this group of clergy and other Christians that were attempting to do a 24-hour prayer movement. And so as part of that, I would go to this church every week, and I would do my shift of prayer. And the pastor had put up this giant banner behind the drum set that said, "Why did Jesus die?" And I became convicted after many weeks of praying for hours looking at that picture. I didn't have a really good answer for that.
Yeah.
I was like, I kind of have an answer for that, but I feel like there's something more. And so when I went to seminary, this became one of the questions that I had, which was like, I started to dig into a lot of patristic soteriology.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how did the fathers of the church talk about salvation? And I began to see, okay, there's something here, and it's more than what I was maybe raised with, which is that my salvation is almost like a juridical declaration,
Right.
and it was more that God's actually interested in saving us to our core.
Mm-hmm.
I said, well, if God saved me, why am I such a mess? Like there's clearly still work that needs to be done. Yeah, I believe that Jesus saved me on the cross,
Mm-hmm.
but he needs to be saving me today too.
Yeah.
And I ran into some works by Augustine and some of the Cappadocian fathers and folks like St. Isaac of Nineveh that were all wrestling with this question. And I began to see that Jesus is not just interested in saving us eschatologically. He's actually interested in transforming us. And that's something that we would have talked about. Maybe talked about glorification or sanctification. But that all of these things are united. Like justification, sanctification, glorification, they are all what happens when we are connected to Jesus.
Yeah.
And then that's something that God's working in us now, and he chooses to do so because one of the things that Augustine had basically said was, God could choose to save us any way, but he chooses in such a way that our will and our life are united in that process, and we get to become participants in that, so that we don't just become declared righteous, but we become made righteous.
Yeah.
And that God doesn't save us without us really becoming transformed. I became hungry for, so what does it take? God,
Yeah.
how do I get that grace?
That's such a big deal, right? Yeah. That whole, because it's sort of like this meta theme, right? You can kind of get into the small, very nitty gritty quibbles about different doctrines or emphases, or whatever. But that bigger question of like, I mean, he's not just going to leave me like this, right? Like great, I'm saved. Boy, I'm still a mess, right? And I recognize that's not going to happen overnight, but that's the great hope that in the end these things all come together, so that I'm not just saved in this transactional legal sense, but that he's going to save me in here.
Yeah. That I teach confirmation at my parish now, and we were just talking about baptism last week, and I reminded the students of something that I was taught many years ago, which is in our baptism, we're given a white garment that's way too big for us. We had to grow into it, you know? And so each day, God's grace, as we open ourselves up to God's grace, to the sacraments, we are grown and strengthened. It's not that we're saving ourselves. Sometimes Catholics get accused of works righteousness because they're so much focused on, that it does matter what we do. But it doesn't matter what we do as somehow balancing out the scorecard in heaven or something like that. It matters what we do, because if we aren't being transformed in our actions, then salvation hasn't taken root in some part of our life. And so if the hope is that salvation that was won once and for all on the cross, if the hope is that if that becomes manifest in every corner and nook and cranny and dark spot in my own life, then it really needs to shine forth. And so my works matter, not because I earn my salvation, because that's where my salvation is made manifest.
It's like when we in love and obedience, when we do good or we do our duty or our vocation, it's like we're opening that area to let the grace in. And I feel like the sacraments keep us really honest on this point too, because I don't know, sometimes from the outside in, maybe people look at the sacraments and think, oh, that's just Catholics. They're doing their things that they're going to save them. But it's like, no, what the sacraments are is like, you do the bare minimum. Like, you show up, wretched as you are, and God promises to show up.
Yeah.
And to give you grace and to feed you in his body and blood and to give you forgiveness. And again, you don't do anything other than show up. Right? It's all grace.
That's the thing that's amazing about it. When I baptize my kids now, I think one of the things I love about it is the moment where they hit the water and they cry because they recognize that something's happened there. It is tangible. It's a tangible enough moment of grace that even an infant recognizes that something has happened. And yet, do they instantly become canonized saints? No. But God offers us graces in these ways that are tangible. If it's up to me, and that's the thing, it's like when I was in this mode of maybe the least sacramental points in my life, I was always like, am I in the Spirit enough? Am I following Jesus enough? Is God there? Is he displeased with me? And it's grace that's so real that you can actually taste it. And it's just like the incarnation, that God chooses to come to us, not with some philosophical treatise. Because if God tried to communicate himself in that way, it would blow our minds. I can barely read Karl Rahner, let alone the Almighty God, right? And so if God showed up in that way, oh no, it would be so far beyond us. If we're trying to make God intelligible in some way. But in Jesus, God comes to us in the universal language that we all know, which is flesh and blood, and continues to come to us with that specific physicality that's undeniable. Did I receive the grace of God this week? Well, I remember how the Eucharist tasted. So yeah, it was there, undeniable. Even if I wasn't there with every piece of my being, even if I didn't meditate and comprehend the depths of the mystery of the incarnation in that moment. Some weeks I'm dealing with like a 2-year-old that's hitting me in the face when I'm going up to receive. There's moments where I'm not showing up with maybe my best self, but God still shows up in a way that it's like, you are receiving me, and you'll never know the depth and fullness of that on your own. But I'm still going to give you the depth and fullness of that, and you can receive it and continue to grow into it. And
that undeniability you said, like, and that's I always think of that with regards to confession, sacrament of reconciliation. That, well, like, when's the best moment to repent? It's like the moment after you sin, right? Like, you don't, even as Catholics, you don't wait to go to confession. No, you repent here and now. Okay, and you try to be truly sorry and try to amend your life. Okay, but then the question comes, like, but how do I know that I'm really sorry? Because I'm a mystery to myself, right? Like, I say sorry all the time, right? I don't really mean it. Sorry, I'm bumping somebody, whatever. How do I know I'm really sorry? Well, it's because I follow through and do what Jesus prescribed. And so, again, that undeniability, that certainty in the midst of, I have a lot of uncertainty about myself. Am I really sorry? Do I really mean this? Am I really going to amend my life? Well, when I go do the thing, again, that Jesus says, I don't do it, I just show up. When I go do what he prescribed, and Christ, through the priest, says, I absolve you of your sins, well, then I know. Right? I know that I'm forgiven. It's not that God can't forgive you, but like, you don't really know if you're repenting unless you're doing what Jesus has called you to do, the gift he's given to you.
Yeah. There's something so sweet about hearing those words. I mean, thinking back when I was a Protestant, I felt like I was always unsure that I had confessed my sins well enough. But to be able to have that tangible way of hearing, like, from somebody else about the forgiveness of my sins, it's a gift. I was so terrified at first. In fact, this is part of my journey. This is maybe a year and a half before I joined the church. I snuck into a Catholic Eucharistic adoration, and they had a priest in the back who was hearing confessions, and I was like, you know what? I'm just going to do it. I don't know if I should have or not, but I did. And I went back there and I told the priest, hey, I'm not Catholic. I've never done confession before, but I'm a sinful guy, and I feel like I just needed to tell Jesus about it and express my need for him in a way that maybe I've never done before. So I sat there and I confessed all the sins that I could think of. And I remember hearing the priest say the words of absolution and just leaving. It just felt like nothing else I've ever experienced before. Just to have that, maybe for the first time, feel like the whole weight of my sin was off. Just something tangible. It's not, I'd gone to lots of altar calls, but then you feel like at the end of it, did it stick? Something about the sacraments that stick in a way that nothing else does. And I love that.
Yeah. So those soteriological conversations, that was a big deal for you.
Yeah, that was maybe there's a lot of theology I had to understand to become Catholic. I had a laundry list of all the reasons I never become Catholic. And slowly and surely, as I began to contemplate and pray, I began to become more and more convinced of most of them through study and reflection. But the soteriology question is the one that, rather than me overcoming it, it's the thing that dragged me as far as the theological issue. It dragged me to the church. In the same way that the Eucharist dragged me to the church, and things like the rosary may have dragged me. There's a lot of the Catholic spiritual practices that I tried became very compelling in bringing me to it in the liturgy a lot. But as far as my study is concerned, it was both soteriology and just getting really deep into the history of the church and recognizing that whatever thing I was trying to build myself was a very different thing than the church had been doing for its whole history. And if I was really serious about coming to seminary because I wanted to be rooted in the depths and riches of the church, I had noticed in my own attempts to plant a church, something was deficient. So if I wanted to take seriously my own deficiency, I needed to be serious about what the church had done historically. And as soon as I started getting historically deep, then I started to realize that everything I had done before probably needed to be reevaluated, because the church as it had been from the first century to the 15th century was a continuity in a way that kind of my own experience of Christianity, sort of bouncing around and trying stuff out and being experimental, it was a radically different way of being church. It was more, I thought a lot at this time about this quote from Yaroslav Pelikan, because I would always condemn the church in its kind of liturgical forms as being traditionalist and dead. But I started reading Yaroslav Pelikan, and he has this one quote where he says, traditionalism is the dead faith of the living, but tradition is the living faith of the dead. And to be able to say, I actually can join into the faith of the saints, of those who have gone before, and I began to see, liturgy changes, it evolves, it has different forms and all of that. But when you're living within a tradition of continuity, there's, in the midst of all of it, something that unites it all. There's a analogy, I'm going to probably imperfectly communicate it, but one of the things that drew me a ton was the writings of John Henry Newman. And in his essay on the development of Christian doctrine, he talks about how the seed of Christ is planted, but it has to grow and change in order to maintain its life. And I often think about this, a seed that you plant next to a river will grow roots around the streams of life versus a seed that's planted on a hill. As the sun moves, or as other things happen, you had to adapt to your environments to stay alive.
Right.
So
Not become something new,
right.
but adapt and change and respond.
And so that's really what Pelikan, I think, was getting at as
Yeah.
well, which is traditionalism is when you codify something and say it becomes a museum, like this is how it was done. But true tradition is a way of saying you're a gardener, you're cultivating the life that is there, and you're helping to. And this is, I think about this a lot, just because even in the Old Testament they sort of talk about like what's the vision of messianic reign and rule. It's like sitting under your own fig tree. Like you have something that's grown and maybe is across generations, and it's alive, and there's a piece that's deep and it's profound. So some of these analogies, all over Scripture, you can't read any of the Scripture really without understanding that what God's doing is something that is living and growing. And the worst thing in the world is to stop doing that. But it has to be kind of the vine that God planted. Yeah. And so I wanted to be grafted onto that. And so that was a big part of it too.
Did you wrestle with, because obviously an important piece of the dynamic that allows that to happen. So neither the dead traditionalism nor the breaking off and of evolving and starting something new, but staying with a living tradition, obviously, is the mechanism for the church as authority and the magisterium. Did you wrestle with that the Pope stuff on your way in?
Yeah, the Pope stuff was maybe the last thing that I had to wrestle with. I had gotten over almost all the stuff. I was like, okay, I guess I can be okay with some of the Mary stuff, which was a challenge, but partially through learning how to pray the rosary, partially through reflecting on the fathers, I had gotten over some of that stuff. I had gotten over, I really embraced sacramental theology in a strong way. Most of the stuff I'd gotten over, but it really came down at the end to, okay, so how do we handle this Pope? That was the last domino on my list of things. And I almost became Orthodox because of that. I was really contemplating Orthodoxy or Catholicism. And I love a lot of things about Orthodoxy. I started sneaking out to Orthodox services, fell in love with the liturgy and the Orthodox tradition as well. I loved the sort of the Eastern patristic writings. The hymns of the Orthodox Church are so beautiful and amazing. There's so much about that tradition that I loved. But then I started showing up to the churches, and people were so confused that I was there. They walk in the door. I'm like, oh, I'm glad you're here. But you're not Ukrainian. You're not Russian. What are you doing here? And that kind of interested me, and I started to look into it. And I started wrestling with two factors. One was when you look at the history of the Orthodox Church, it's a little bit more prone to heresy, a little bit more prone to nationalism, and to the certain branches becoming almost like vassals to the state. And so that really bothered me. Look at the other side, and I really couldn't get my head around the Pope. Why would God choose like one guy? It seems so weird. I just couldn't get behind it. So I wrestled back and forth. I started to see there's some advantages to having a Pope, because that means the church has a guardrail against despots that wield their power and can control maybe a church in a particular place. And it doesn't make it completely immune to the politics, but it's a good bulwark against it. But I couldn't see it in Scripture. I had seen, Jesus says to Peter, "On this rock I will build my church," but I hadn't been convinced of that, and so I was thinking, how? Because I was still trying to say, like, if something this important there needs to be at least some kind of a continuity to the Gospels, right? And so I'll tell you the story about how this one fell for me, because it was really the last straw. And I've talked to you about this before, but I was, for some reason, my wife had accidentally bought this book, A Catholic Catechism by John Hardon, the Jesuit priest. And thinking that she was buying the Catholic Catechism.
Oh.
And so it showed up, and I was reading through it on our way back from Chicago, because we were living in Chicago. I was working at a church out there, and I was finishing up my studies out there at the time. And so I was reading it on our way back to Michigan. And there's this part in the book where he makes an argument not based on this rock passage, but on a way. It's in Matthew, I think it's 24:14, I think is the reference. I could be wrong. But it's where he's sending out the apostles, not the Great Commission. It's a little bit before that. But he says, you're going to go out into the whole world, and everyone is going to hear the message, and then the end's going to come. And Hardin basically says it's kind of amazing that he would commission 12 guys on this impossible mission of going into the whole world and having a mission until the end of time, or the end of the age, if you will, if there was no plan for continuity.
Yeah.
Like, this is a mission that's too big for these 12 guys to fulfill, but he gave it to these 12 guys. He's like, these guys are going to do it, and it's a mission that's going to last for the rest of history as we know it, right? And it's a mission that's going to go to every corner of the globe. So I said, that's actually a good point. And my heart had always been for reaching into these corners, and my frustration had always been like, I can't do it on my own, because I recognize when I bring myself too much into it, when it's all about me, it's a problem. I was desperate and hungry for that continuity. And so Hardin says, there needs to be a center of unity so that we know we're with that group, that we know that we're part of that commissioned band of brothers, if you will, that's on mission in this world. We know, because the end has not yet come, and there are still people who have not yet heard, that we're still in the midst of fulfilling this commission. So where's the group of guys that I can stand shoulder to shoulder with and engage in this mission and ministry? And so this is what I was thinking through. It's like, this is what the papacy is about. It's helping us make sure that as the church continues to grow and evolve and change to meet the challenges of this present age and the darknesses that we're encountering and confronting, that we're connected to that authority that was given by Christ's command to do the things that we're doing.
Right.
So I was contemplating that. And so that's what led me to come back. And it was over the Easter weekend. It would have been 12, 13 years ago. And I went to the Easter vigil. And during that is when God really said to me, I had snuck out. I was just by myself during the Exalted. I started hearing this voice: "You need to become Catholic. You need to become Catholic. You need to become Catholic." And so that stuck with me for the entirety of the Easter Vigil, which, as you know, is a hours long thing, and then all the way out into the parking lot. And I finally told God, "Shut up. I can't deal with this right now. You don't understand. Ministry is how I support my family. It's where I've got, years and years of theological education. It's like really the only professional work I've done. Like, don't ask me to do this. It's going to be too hard." But he wouldn't stop. So I said, "Okay, we'll pray about it." And so the next day we celebrated Easter with our families, and then we drove back to Chicago. And that following Monday, I believe, I told my wife I need to go take a prayer walk down by the Chicago River, which is near our house. And at that point, I brought my Bible, and I was going to play Bible roulette, where you open up and you put your finger down and you see if your finger and God's providence align. And so I was going to do that. But as I pulled my Bible out, I sat down by this street lamp. This guy runs out of nowhere. He runs up to me and he says, "Hey, are you reading the Bible?" "Is that a Bible?" he says. I said, "Yeah, it's a Bible." He goes, "Can you open it up and read Matthew 24:14 to me.
I remember
The same
the story,
passage.
yeah.
So I open it up and I read the passage to the guy. He goes, "Thanks," and he runs down the street. And I'm sitting there, and this was the thing. I was like, "This is the last domino." And I sat down. There's a bench nearby. I just sat down on the bench, and I couldn't move. I was like, "Oh God, what am I doing?" And so I immediately, like, there's a library nearby. I went into it. I emailed a friend of mine who teaches at a Sacred Heart Seminary in Detroit. It was Catholics, one of the Catholics I knew, and I said, "I have some good or bad news. I think God's calling me to become Catholic, and I don't know what to do about it." And he said, "You should probably pray about it." And so I got a spiritual director that week, and I said, "I'm going to live my life like a Catholic for a year and discern it." And so I started doing everything that was Catholic. I had already been sort of doing the rosary and the liturgy. I'm going to do the weird stuff that I'm uncomfortable with. I'll do consecration to Mary. I'll like go on a pilgrimage. I'll venerate an icon. I'll do it all and see what happens. And after a few months of doing that, it was over. I knew I'm encountering Jesus so profoundly, so whole person, holistically, just in the depths of my being in a way I've never experienced before. I got to do it. But yeah, the papacy was the last theological hurdle I had to get over before really the downhill trajectory towards crossing the Tiber got fully underway.
Well, praise God. Well, one of the things, and we've already gotten to a little bit, but one of the focuses here on this show versus Journey Home, the hour goes fast. But I really wanted to dig more into those devotions and stuff in the sense of, right, sometimes it's more the intellectual is the reason that someone makes the decision to become Catholic, right? As Chesterton says, why did you become Catholic? Well, it's 1,000 reasons, all amounting to one reason that I believe it's true. Well, what do we mean by true? Well, it's the true church Christ established to give himself to us and to save us and to sanctify us, right? And so becoming Catholic then, so what are some of the things you found? I know you have a great story about the rosary. Tell us about that.
Yeah, sure. So, as I mentioned, there's all sorts of things that freaked me out with the Catholic Church. You grew up Lutheran. I remember when I was growing up, there's entire chapel services. They would just basically take the Catholic Church out back and like talk about how terrible it was. One of my early mentors in this group was a person who he was really anti-Catholic. And so, he was one of my early mentors, would run me through all the reasons why the Catholic Church is terrible. And I was honestly afraid of a lot of Catholic spirituality. I thought, it's going to open me up to demons or something, because it's
and then you'll have to call a Catholic priest. I mean,
I was fearful there was idolatry, or honoring Mary was tantamount to a false god or something, right? So this is a few years before I became Catholic. I would say the rosary played a big role in my spirituality on the journey to becoming Catholic. And it took a long time for me to get there. But one of the key things was I was at the Ann Arbor Art Fair. It's like a big event in Ann Arbor. They have all these artists that come out and sell their wares. But there's a section where nonprofits can sit up as well, and they can share about whatever it is that they want to talk about, environmentalism or tuberculosis. I don't know. They had one table there that I was walking through, and I like talking to these folks. They'd give me their literature, and I would put it in my bag, and put it in my bag, and put it in my bag. But one table was not giving out literature. They were handing out rosaries. And so I came up to the table, and I don't even know if I had a conversation with the guy. Someone just said, "Hey, would you like a rosary?" And I said, "Sure." Just like I was throwing all the other literature in my bag, I took a rosary and I put it in there. And I went about my business. And I got home, and like anytime you go to a conference or something, you get home and you look at, why did I grab all this stuff? I'm never gonna read up on tuberculosis. I'm never, whatever it is. So I was just throwing everything away. I threw away all the pamphlets. I threw away the, whatever the little pens or whatever that they give you. But I got to the rosary, and there's something in me that's like, I can't throw this away. Like, there's a picture of Jesus on it. Like, I'll just hold on to it. And so I held on to it for a bit, and I was just curious about this thing. I didn't know how to pray the rosary at all. I had seen them. I had friends that were Catholic growing up. I'd seen them in their houses, and so, like I said, it was kind of a weird thing to me. Very, very mysterious, very strange. But I thought, okay, I don't know what to do with this, but I'm at least going to pray with this thing. So I held the beads, and I would just go about my prayers. And there's something about that I really liked. Sometimes I would even finish my prayers, and I would just kind of work my way through the beads, saying nothing, but it helped me just remain present to God.
Yeah.
And so I thought, well, the beads themselves are really helpful. And I know that I've been told the rosary is just repetitive prayer, and it's what Jesus warns us against this. But maybe I'll try it once. So I got this. I walked into a Catholic church actually, and there was a pamphlet on how to pray the rosary. So I grabbed the pamphlet, and I took it home with me. And it was a pamphlet on the scriptural rosary, so it was less scary because it was like, okay, I'm not just going to say a Hail Mary. I'm going to read this Bible passage, and I'll go through. So I tried that, and I thought, oh, this is nice. But then I started getting used to it, and I began to actually take some time praying with the rosary, and it was amazing. I never expected it, but it was almost like Mary showed up. And I had never really had a relationship with Mary at all. Catholics talked about her. I was like, it's so weird that Catholics talk about her. But as I was praying through the different mysteries and praying through these beads, I began to realize that the rosary is not about praying to Mary. It's about praying with Mary. And as I was praying, Mary began to show me what her life was like in those moments, and I began to see through her how deeply she loved Jesus. And I was like, oh my God, she's the greatest prayer partner I've ever had. She loves Jesus so much. So every time, like I would say a pray Hail Mary, I was like, oh, I'm just being drawn back to loving Jesus. And I've got this amazing example of someone who loves Jesus way more than I ever could, and who's been responding to God's grace in a way that I'm desiring to. And so I began to fall in love with the rosary because it helped me fall in love with Jesus. And it helped me fall in love with Jesus because his mother loves Jesus so well. And pretty soon it became not something that was scary to me, but it became something that was just a tremendous help. Because on days when I didn't love Jesus very much, I had someone who did, that could pray with me. Even to this day, I have a rosary. I keep it in my car. I drive to and from Detroit every day from where I live in Ypsilanti. It's, maybe a 40-minute drive. And not a day goes by where at some point I feel like, oh, I need to pull the beads out. I need somebody to help me love Jesus. I might be going into something, maybe coming out. Sometimes I'll be sitting in the parking lot and I just need to do a decade of this right now, because it helps me to love Jesus in a way that is profound. And it really opened up my eyes to the reality of the Gospels from the perspective of someone who lived through them, who experienced it, but who still is there drawing us into that same story, because the story didn't end with the mysteries of the rosary. It continues today as God continues to be at work. And one of the things I've found that's really profound is if you aren't constantly reminded of the story that you're living, you're going to be drawn into a different story. Our culture tells us so many different stories about what this world is about, whether it's about power, whether it's about fame, whether it's about riches, whether it's about our own pleasure or whatever. There's all these stories that our culture and our sinful nature and the devil will seek to draw us into and make that what it's about. The rosary tells us, no, you're a part of a different story. It's a story that doesn't have you at the center, but you can be a part of it as you learn to love with Jesus, to love Jesus, and to love Jesus with his mother.
Yeah.
And that's been a great boon in my own life.
It seems like there's a great providence in the communion of saints, because, like, as you said, we would have a tendency, even when we go into our closet and, pray to our Father in secret who sees in secret, we would still have a tendency to make our faith about us. And it's like there's this great providence in how God has chosen to work through Mary and the saints and through our works of mercy, and that he keeps like driving us outwards and saying, no, you're actually going to have to like be with people and love them and let yourself be loved by them and helped by them and help them, so that you can't keep making the faith about you.
Yeah. No, I think that's entirely right. And that's the one thing as a Protestant, I struggled often because prayer was so much based on what was happening in me. And a lot of Catholic practice has helped me really realize, oh my gosh, prayer's not about what I can muster. So to me, things like the rosary, as well as liturgy, the hours.
Yeah.
So the liturgy hours is now the backbone of my prayer life. I make it a point to try to pray all 7 hours every day.
Oh, that's awesome.
Do I do it every day? No. But the nice thing about aiming for 7 is you usually get like 4 or 5. So I'm given the words of the church to pray every single day. So even if I don't, I wake up in the morning and that's the first thing I do is I pray Psalm 95 on my way to, grab my prayer books or whatever it is. And then I kind of get settled as I'm reciting that. And then throughout the rest of the day, you're being drawn and given words into this. And when you start with the prayer of the church, when you start with giving glory to God, when you start with the right story, then your story begins to have the right context. But if I start saying, oh God, back when I'm Protestant, maybe I would start my prayer like looking through my calendar. And I get to my calendar eventually in my prayer. I should be praying through. Yeah. I should be, honestly, I should be praying through every email. I should be praying through every event. I don't always do it, but that's what I should be doing. Yeah. But I shouldn't be starting with my own concerns. I should be starting with praise of God, giving him the day, offering it into his hands, being reminded of the story that I lead. And I think about that all the time, because the way that we contextualize the story we're in is so critical. Yeah. If I'm living a story that begins once upon a time, everything I expect is leading towards happily ever after. If it starts a dark and stormy night, everything that it leads is, going to be clouded with foreboding, right? If I start a story out a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, everything is expecting lightsabers. But if I start the day off, I believe in God the Father. If I start the day off, praise to our Lord and Savior. If I start the day off, Hail Mary, full of grace, then it contextualizes everything else that I bring to it. And I do need to bring everything to my prayer. But it contextualizes it in its right place.
I love that. Yeah.
So
I love that. Yeah, the connection between they're both obviously important, but I think oftentimes we get the order wrong, right? Yeah. Like we start and we place as the highest my personal prayer and cry de coeur, my prayer, prayer from the heart. And it's so important, right? But it's almost like in human relationships we do this too, right? Like I start, like the most important words I say to my wife, I didn't compose. I love you, right? It's like I learn through the forms, the rituals, through getting down on one knee, through offering a ring, through going through the ritual of marriage, through the manners and mores of human life. It's like what we're given gives the context for the relationship, for the communication. And then it's in that we learn to compose our own love letters and to make our own prayers.
Yeah, that is actually a fantastic point. And it's one of the things I love about how liturgy and tradition actually can help us be formed. If I try to invent since I go to different weddings, of different friends. Some people are not Catholics at all, and so they're choosing a poem that they like as a reading, or they're writing their own vows, and it always feels a little hollow compared to going to a Catholic mass. And there's something just absolutely beautiful about letting the church and the body of Christ sort of do the heavy lifting of contextualizing your life. And then you learn that the goal of my life is not to discover who I am, but to become the person who Jesus would be if Jesus for me. I already have the end in mind. I don't know how it's going to look exactly. I don't know the path to get there, but the fundamental thing is I want to be like Jesus. I want to look, in my case, like Jesus would look in the 21st century, as a husband and a father and a worker in Southeast Michigan, where I live. I want to look like Jesus there, and hopefully you want to look like Jesus in Northern Ohio, and everyone, we can become that person, because that's the story, is Jesus becoming manifest in the world. And I only have a small place. Like, there's one small corner of the world where God has said, all right, I've given this corner of the world for you to be me. I've given up this small corner of the world where you can image who I am in this way, where you can be a splash of sanctity, where my love will overflow out of you and hit this little space around you. But the story is God's doing that in 1 billion lives across millennia. And even if my splash isn't perfect, the story that I'm living is marked by grace. If it's all about me discovering, if I'm trying to figure out how I can make my marriage kind of about me and making it about the story where I'm at the center, or if I'm trying to make my job about me or whatever, that's an exhausting thing. Oh my gosh. But if I'm just saying, God's redeeming the world, and I get to be a part of it, then even in the small things of life, there's freedom. And it's almost counterintuitive, because we think that freedom is being controlled by nothing. But freedom is not being controlled by nothing. Freedom is being conformed to the image we were created to be. And that's so much more free.
Yeah. One of the things that Catholicism does in its through its liturgy and through its universality, right, is it again, like we said earlier, it keeps calling us out of ourselves, putting us in collision with the saints and with other people, right, who are very different than us in all sorts of different ways. I know since you've become Catholic, you've just been involved in like a dizzying number of initiatives and projects. So many of them just tied really to this, like meeting the other, being in community, entering into fellowship. Talk a little bit about that. Where did that come from in your life?
Becoming Catholic is a terrifying thing for a lot of guys in my position. I know you deal with this all the time with the Coming Home Network, because you have this belief that God's called you to something. And then when you become Catholic, in some cases, not in all cases, but in some cases, because of the place of life that you're at, you have to give up your preconceived notions of what that's supposed to look like. So for me, my identity was pastor, minister, I had to give that up when I became Catholic. Now I was a lay person, Joe Schmo on the street. What does that look like? But there's still a part of you that says, well, God called me to something. And my heart, like I said before, is always, how do we communicate God's love to other people? And so the first thing I did, so I was in D.C. Yeah. After I became Catholic, I was like, what am I going to do? So I decided I was going to get my PhD in Catholic theology. So I went to Washington, D.C. This is actually, as I was becoming Catholic, I left the job I had in Chicago, jumped out, like I was in the midst of a sort of a call process to pastoral ministry. And I just in that, I was like, I'm at this point, we've got to do something else. So I spent summer as a hospital chaplain doing a unit of CPE, and then I joined a PhD program out in DC. And because I thought, well, I don't know what the future holds, but I know that I can't deny that God's called me to serve His church with my life. So I got to figure out what that looks like. So I went to Catholic U and eventually got my PhD in liturgy and sacramental theology with scripture as an allied field. And one of the reasons I wanted to do that is I had fallen in love with the liturgy, but I didn't understand it at all. And so I thought, I want to go make sure that I've got a good understanding of what this whole Catholic world is about. So I'll jump into this thing here. Began to do work there. In my time in DC, I spent time as a fellow at Bread for the World, I was kind of the national fellow on Catholic relations. So it was sort of my job to try to cajole all the Catholics to get behind initiatives to address hunger in the world. And so that was really interesting, because so I went from like being a Protestant one year to the next year meeting with the papal nuncio and the bishops and like talking to all these Catholic leaders about the work of caring for the poor. Now, this had been a part of my life even before I became Catholic. I was very involved in doing work with local food banks and pantries and volunteering in those ways and helping lead mission trips. In fact, one of the critical moments in my own professional, spiritual, and ministerial development was when I led a group of students to Mexico, and we were working in some of the slums there. And one day when we were working on a church kind of just built in the middle of abject poverty, a fire broke out and it burned down half the community all around us when we were there. And I remember kneeling in a pile of garbage that was just the front of the church as I saw the smoke billowing and seeing the little that these people had destroyed, and coming to the conviction that if the church understood the suffering of the people, we couldn't live the way that we are. Like, the only way that the gospel can be rooted in someone's heart and our response to suffering is as maybe limited as it is because we're not seeing it. So I became a bit convicted, and it's been the story of my journey that I'm convicted that I need to be connected to the suffering, because it's in that I think Jesus is imaged. I was always reflecting in Matthew 25, which I think is like the spoiler alert of the Gospels, where Jesus says that in the hungry and the thirsty and the imprisoned, as we care for them, we've been caring for Him. Yeah. It's like Jesus is like an end of a Scooby-Doo episode where they pull off the mask. It was Jesus all along. And so I said, I don't want to miss Jesus. Like, Jesus told us that He's going to be in these corners of the world. And even if it's hard, I want to be there. So I became Catholic, so I couldn't be a pastor, but I could be a Christian. And all of us are called to respond to the needs. So I began by doing work at the you might call it grass tops level after I became Catholic. And I got pretty disenchanted with the political process in DC. It's not that there's not value in it, but for me, it wasn't what I had, you're still not seeing Jesus, right? like if you're meeting with senators and talking about poverty, it's pretty easy to get dragged into the wrong story.
Yeah.
And I saw that all over the place. You're going to a party that's catered by the nicest food. You're meeting with the richest people, and you're saying maybe the right words, but you're surrounded by the wrong story. And so I started rethinking, well, okay, so maybe grass tops politics isn't where I want to be engaged. So then I got a phone call from a pastor who was working at Grace, that church that I had helped to kickstart back in Michigan. And he wanted to start a coffee and tap house. Now, part of my story that you didn't hear is over the course of all of this, I had been moonlighting as a professional coffee guy. Like I was taking international coffee trips, teaching farmers about best practices. I was training baristas.
Cool.
I had started doing coffee work when I had first got into ministry just to help pay the bills.
Yeah.
But I fell in love with it because you're starting to build relationships with people who are far from God in a very authentic way. Like I used to, like early on in my ministry, I would grab some friends and we'd go street preaching, or we'd go knock door to door and pass out Bible tracts or whatever. And it just wasn't working well for me. People weren't like thrilled I was showing up on their door and, oh, you want to tell me about Jesus? Come on in. I'm going to give my life to him right now. Now, there's some people that probably have that gifting, and I've been positively impacted by some of them. Like I said, it was a street evangelist that gave me a rosary that made a huge impact on my life. But in my life, working as a barista on the side, I started meeting people, and every week they'd ask questions, and pretty soon you're telling them about your ministry, you're telling them about the church you're involved with. And I was having an atheist invite me over to do Bible studies, and I was like, okay, this is a cool thing. Mm-hmm. So I got into coffee, and then I fell in love with the kind of the artistry of it. Yeah. So for a number of years, I was very involved with the coffee industry as well, and I taught coffee classes in Chicago and all that while I was doing my studies, in addition to working in the churches and things like that. So this guy knew about this because Sung, the pastor that I had been working with at Grace, told him, and he had wanted to start a coffee shop and a tap house. So he called me up and he wanted some advice, and got convinced that he didn't just want my advice, he wanted to partner with me. So he convinced me to move back to Michigan, and we started this coffee shop called Cultivate. And so it was founded on three values: craft, community, and cause. Craft, we're going to serve the best beer, serve the best coffee. Mm-hmm. Community, we're going to bring people together all the time. Mm-hmm. And the thing that's going to unite us is a cause. And we wanted a cause that really united everybody together. And so I had been doing work around hunger for a long time. So we said, we're going to try to orient this place around how do we disrupt the root causes of people who are hungry in our community. Mm-hmm. So we started a community garden. We donated the profits to nonprofits and things like that. And so for a few years there, we were building. You visited it before.
Yeah, it was fun. I brought my kids there.
It was a really cool space.
It really was. Yeah.
After a couple years of doing that, I still had the sense that I wanted to get closer to where Jesus was at, and the people that. So I was raising money and I was bringing awareness around the hungry people in our community, but I was still selling top of the line beers and coffee, which in many cases, you're not seeing a lot of people. No, I did. I bought a lot of coffees for a lot of people who walked in the door who couldn't afford it. Mm-hmm. And there was people in the community that really became a part of the life there that were amongst the most vulnerable. Mm-hmm. But there was an organization that was a Christian nonprofit that was feeding and clothing. They weren't really clothing, they were to a certain degree, but they're feeding and caring for us. A free medical clinic, free food program, a diaper program, and all that sort of stuff. It's called Hope Clinic. Mm-hmm. And they were going through a kind of a crisis of leadership. So I reached out to them. One thing led to another, and I got brought in and I started working there. So for about 6 years, I was helping lead. I was the COO at the Hope Clinic, where we were able to, fill over 100,000 requests for help every year of the people of the community, the margins of society, and being able to see Jesus in that way. And then about a year ago, I moved into my current role, where I'm the executive director at the Pope Francis Center, where we're working to end chronic homelessness in the city of Detroit. And so every morning we're feeding about 250 people a couple meals, showers, laundry. And then we just launched this campus where we're creating housing for a period of time, where we're taking the most vulnerable and really investing in them, putting them in a community. We have an on-site medical clinic, gym, classes, vocational training, service opportunities, and just trying to take the people who have failed out of the system over and over and over again, and giving them an opportunity to have that reset, to expand the avenue of hope. So to your initial question, in the midst of all this flurry, and there's a bunch of other little things too, what have I been trying to do? And I've thought about this. I think the big thing is I'm still trying to be a person who is bringing the light of Christ into the darkest corners. And that's what I wanted to do as a pastor. That's what I wanted to do as a minister earlier. It's what I wanted to do all the way along the lines. But now I'm doing it in a way that's maybe a little decentralized from church on Sunday and more every other day of the week, which is kind of a nice thing. Yeah. And in the midst of all these things, my hope has always been not that I could be the person that goes out and does it, but you had to have a community that people are invited into, a community that tells a different story. If I can meet somebody on the street, that was a problem with me as a street preacher. I could tell the story of Jesus to them, but they can even believe it in that moment, but they're going to move into a different context where a different story is dominating their life. Yeah. But if you can build a community that it will never be perfect, but at least that pushes people towards an orientation of, hey, you're made with dignity, you're worthy of respect. God formed you with a plan and a purpose, not a love. Yeah. If you can be in a part of people, a group of people that believe that, even if you don't believe that yourself, I think the community will help you to find a place where that seed of hope that you have value can start to grow. Yeah. So I think that's why maybe, but
that's so good. And it seems like another big important piece of that I think we appreciate as Catholics is just the importance of families as building that like ground level of stability around which communities can then form and cohere. I was having a conversation a few years ago with my wife, and I were talking to Mark Barnes and Jacob Imam from the New Polity group in Steubenville about money stuff and virtues and stuff like that. And we were talking about the the rich young ruler, that story, and I think it was Jacob made the comment that like when we think of the story like that, the question is not whether we are called to live out the gospel radically in the way that Christ called the rich young ruler to. In other words, sell all you have and follow me. It's not prudence doesn't dictate it. It's a question of whether. No, we do, but the question is how. Right. So we're all called to that level, but it's the how, and so that discernment, and so families being such an important piece of that. If you build up that place of stability, the people, the connections, the community around which these kinds of projects can cohere and exist.
Yeah, I think that's key. Family is core. I work with a lot of guys that have never really had a family. A lot of the guys you meet on the street come from either broken homes, foster homes, whatever it is. And so that's why it's so critical that you begin to start with just a group, just a small community, people who care for each other. Yeah. And then as a person who has kids too, I got 5 boys, it's so critical for me also to make sure that I'm building the right foundation in that vocation too.
Mm-hmm.
And so that, I think that's a challenge that maybe the church needs to reflect more on. Is, I think at times we've fallen into the trap of thinking, is God calling me to live all out for him?
Mm-hmm.
Not how is God calling me to live all
Right.
out for him? And the way that we live life with a family all out for Jesus is so important, and it's also so hard, because when you have no one that depends on you and you have nothing, it's really easy to give everything to Jesus. But the more you become ensconced in community, the more you actually have temptations to begin to think about different economies, the economies of this world, the economies of financial stability or whatever. But Jesus continually calls us back to say, no, we want to live lives of radical generosity. But then prudence is that process of realizing, how do I hold on to nothing and yet care prudently for the organization that I lead? How do I care prudently for the men who are in my facility? How do I care prudently for my children and their education, food on the table? And that's discernment that I think we all need to engage in. But I do think we're at a place right now where the church needs to really maybe reflect on, how do we help to grow families to be all out for Jesus? How do we grow professionals to be all out for Jesus? And not just, monks or priests or whatever.
Yeah.
So,
well, I'm blessed by with big messy families, and again, this is something my wife we talk about, just that it teaches you, it gets you over being scandalized by difference, right? Like it's a big, messy, loud family, that if you really embrace that sort of sets everybody in the family more open to, I can go out there and meet people who are very different and different messy, because we're just a big hot mess. Like I think sometimes when we, in the modern world, we live lives that are too sanitized and too comfortable and too predictable, it's like that makes it so much then harder to reach out to the other. Oh. Hey man, I kept you here for a long time. Before we part ways, anything you want to share in terms of, again, you've already told about your projects now, but where people can find out more about those, or anything you want to share before we wrap it up?
I think
open mic.
You give me a pretty open mic already today. I don't have any big books to plug or anything amazing to do. I've been thinking a lot about, I work really closely with this Jesuit priest, Father Tim McCabe, and we've been contemplating a lot of things together around how we serve the homeless in Detroit. And I guess I've been thinking a lot about St. Teresa of Calcutta and her directive to find your own Calcutta, wherever it is that you're at. So my final thought would be, wherever you are at the journey, God has given you a place to be, him to the world. He's given you a place where you can embody his kingdom. And it might be just as a person who's raising a family in virtue. It might be ministering to those in your neighborhood who have great need. But I would encourage people to every day try to pray with as much sincerity as possible that part of the Our Father, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, and apply it to your own life. Because that's a pretty amazing invitation.
Yeah. Thanks so much, brother.
Yeah.
Keep up the good work.
Yeah.
All right.